the slides.
Hallo, ich bin Fernando Oliveira Paulino. Wir sind da Universidade of Brasília. Olá, meu nome é Fernando Oliveira Paulino. Essa é uma sessão de uma masterclass realizada a partir da Universidade de Brasília. Nós temos a honra e a alegria de ter conosco o pesquisador Dominik Speck. Dominik, danke schön für Ihre Präsenz hier. A apresentação do Dominik vai ser feita em inglês, e ele preparou gentilmente alguns slides em português, e eu vou também fazer um esforço aqui para traduzir e dar encaminhamento a perguntas, a comentários que sejam feitos sobretudo pelo YouTube, que transmite essa sessão através do canal FAC. Então já peço desde já para as pessoas interessadas que coloquem perguntas, comentários no nosso canal, para que depois eu apresente para o Dominik. Eu vou auxiliá-lo passando os slides, né? Nesse primeiro, acho que vocês já conseguem ver que o Dominik é um pesquisador com atuação destacada na Universidade de Dortmund e tem também desenvolvido várias atividades ligadas à comunicação pública, sobretudo a partir da European Broadcast Union. Mas eu vou deixar ele contar essa história e a gente, então, com isso, inicia formalmente essa masterclass. Please, bitte Dominik, the time is yours.
Obrigado, Fernando, e boa tarde. As Fernando said, I will talk in English, as my Portuguese is not yet good enough, well enough to do the presentation in your language, but I hope you will still have the chance to follow it, as the slides are in Portuguese. So welcome to this presentation about trends and challenges for public communication, public service media in Europe. It will be a very, let's say, rough flashlight. We don't have the time to go into much detail. Europe is very diverse. Public service media is very diverse as a topic, but I will try to present you with some of the most pressing issues and challenges that are around right now. You can already see myself here on the slide, and I think Fernando already told a bit about myself, so I don't have to tell it by myself, and I will directly start with the definition of what I'm actually talking about when talking about PSB or PSM, because as you will see, I will use different terms. I will use public service broadcasting, which is abbreviated by PSB, and which is pretty much the very old way and still the very common way of how we define public media. It is through the means of broadcasting, because historically speaking, the state has organized the transmission of audiovisual services in Europe, because historically only a few frequencies to transmit media, audiovisual media, have been there, so the state has been taking care of it, unlike in the print sector, for example, and still until today, public service companies are still pretty much centered around the field of broadcasting. So when I talk about PSB, it's mainly because in many of the countries it is still PSB and not the next definition on the slide, which is public service media, which is mostly in many countries still an ideal, which means that public service broadcasting really transforms into a digital environment. It has happened, of course, in the countries, but still many of the companies that produce public media are pretty much public service broadcasters, the last point on the slide. So rather than talking about public service media organizations, we would still prefer to talk about public service broadcasters, because their structure is still pretty much centered around audiovisual content production. So what are we talking about when we talk about Europe? Europe is maybe the continent which is most hard to define in geographical terms, and within the European Union, within the member states of the European Union, we associate Europe with the European Union, but of course Europe is much broader than the European Union, which has 27 member states and which is only half the size of Brazil. So we somehow managed to fit 27 states into half of the size of one state of Brazil. But Europe is much larger, and according to some definitions, also the northern parts of Africa are at least very close to Europe. So apart from the European Union, there's also the Council of Europe as another much less known organization which has 46 members. In terms of public broadcasting, there's like one organization, the European Broadcasting Union, which, as Fernando said, I also worked for in the past and still contribute to by doing research. And in this union, there are even 56 member states, some of them also from outside of Europe, and all in all, it's 112 public service broadcasting organizations in the EBU, which already shows that we are talking about quite diverse fields. And even though in the European Union, I will talk about this later, we have many fields of policy that are pretty much integrated, that are pretty much centralized by the European Union in the field of broadcasting, the national member states still have the say. They still decide what public service media, public service broadcasting is in their countries. So there is a broad variety of national contexts. Okay, I will continue now to talk a bit about organizational structures and funding structures and governance structures of public service media in Europe. Just a very rough overview for you to understand better what I'm talking about in the next section, which will be more about trends and problems and challenges. So public service media in Europe, and we already continued with the next slide, are very strong and trusted if we compare it to the case of, for example, the US, but also other countries in the Americas, where public service broadcasters tend to be rather small enterprises. In Europe, not in all, but in many countries, they are really important for shaping national cultures, like, for example, the BBC in the UK. And this is also reflected in trust figures for public service media. So in 28 of the 31 colored countries you see on this map, from research I've done for the EBU, you will notice that public service news, so not the organization itself, but the news they produce, are the most trusted news sources nationwide, which might already show a bit the relevance that these broadcasters have in these countries. And to continue, even though they have this unique trust across all countries, they work quite different across the whole of Europe. So the way to organize public service broadcasting, to have only one huge or many small organizations, really differs from country to country. We have federalist systems, with Germany being the prime example. In Germany there is a total of 12 public broadcasters within one country, which makes, I think, Germany the country with the most differentiated public service media system in Europe. I think if you compare it to Brazil, you have even much more public broadcasters at different levels. But in Germany, in terms of Europe, this is the most differentiated system, which works pretty much on a regional level. For historical reasons, the federal government of Germany doesn't have a say in organizing broadcasting, so it's the federal states that set up their own broadcasters. But on a nationwide level, we also have nationwide broadcasters, which are, however, constituted jointly by all the federal states. Then there are some other countries which are also politically more federal and which have the particular case of uniting different languages within a single nation state, like Belgium and Switzerland, where in Belgium we have French, German, and Flemish-speaking parts, and in Switzerland we have German, French, and Italian-speaking parts, and all these language regions have their own public broadcaster. There are also some other examples like the UK or Denmark, where there's really a strong nationwide public broadcaster which both broadcasts radio, TV, and online services, but which is then complemented by some other broadcasters that are organized in more commercial ways, but that also have to serve some public service obligations. Another example are the systems in which there are very strong nationwide public broadcasters which both serve radio and TV, like in Finland, Norway, and Austria, and Portugal, for example. And the other cases, next cases, are countries in which radio and TV organizations are separated. There's one nationwide large TV broadcaster and one nationwide large radio broadcaster, such as in Czech Republic, Estonia, or Romania. And a very special case, which we can't go into detail here, it would maybe take one semester to explain this, is the case of the Netherlands. The Dutch society works pretty much in terms of so-called pillars of society, which go back to a historical situation when the country was really divided into, let's say, social groups, more on the religious side, more on the labor union, civil society, organization side, and until today their public broadcaster is being jointly produced, their public broadcasting program is being jointly produced by organizations that reflect these different factions or pillars of society. So when we talk about PSM in Europe, or maybe even worldwide, the BBC, UK broadcaster, is always mentioned as a prime example, probably because it's somehow the oldest and also trend-setting historically public broadcaster. However, some scholars and observers have also argued to not always use the BBC as a model, but rather to learn from different examples from different parts of Europe, or also different other parts of the world, because recently also the BBC has come under scrutiny for a lot of, for example, political meddling into its affairs. So maybe the governance safeguards that are in place to secure the BBC from governmental interference are not well enough, sufficient enough, and should not serve as a prime example. Having said that, there is a variety of governance models and regulatory models for PSM in Europe. Sometimes there is like one regulatory agency, such as Ofcom in the UK, that regulates the broadcasting sector. In other cases, such as in Germany, it's a very differentiated system of broadcasting councils that include members of the civil society and that are formed on a voluntary basis. Sometimes it is also includes audience councils, and this already shows you that public service broadcasting in Europe is quite diverse, and we cannot simply transfer like one model to the other. We have always to see what are the governance structures, how would things play out in one region compared to another, or one state compared to another. And this also is true with regard to the degree of political interference and political independence. In some countries, the broadcaster might be closer to state and to government, whereas in others, opportunities of the government to interfere with public broadcasting might be more limited. And this was more on the governance side. You remember the slide with the trust figures showing the trust is quite high in many of the countries of Europe. The same is not true with regard to the market share figures, which in some countries are actually quite low. So for example, in Ukraine, these are figures from before the war, so maybe right now public broadcasting has become a bit more important due to the political situation, but before the war, the public broadcasters of Ukraine had very low market shares on both TV and radio markets, whereas in especially Northern European countries such as Iceland, Denmark, but also the Central European countries, Czech Republic or Germany, public broadcasting has very large market shares. So we didn't talk about how public broadcasters get their money yet, which is of course also an important point, an important entrance point for, let's say, political interference to decide on the way of how public broadcasters get funded, and on the still most popular model across Europe is to collect a license fee directly from the people. So it's money that is organized from outside the state budget. It is collected by public broadcasters themselves, or sometimes also by telecommunications or postal services. And all the households in the country have to pay it in some of the states, such as Germany, or, which is the more historical way of collecting it, only those households who possess a TV or radio device. Of course, nowadays anyone can watch or listen to public service content on computers or smartphones, so that's why in some of the countries all of the households now have to pay, regardless of whether they possess a TV or a radio device. In some countries, however, the funds for public broadcasters are organized directly through the state budget and are part of budget negotiations in parliament, which is somehow a democratic way to organize this, but also a good entry point for political interference, because each year usually it has to be renegotiated, and this can lead to politicians putting public service broadcasters under pressure. A way to avoid this is to organize the budget for public broadcasters outside of the state budget. It is part of the state money in this case. It's not a license fee that is directly collected from the people. It's part of the tax budget, but it's not part of the usual state budget to somehow safeguard the independence of public broadcasters. It's a relatively new model that has been introduced in Finland and Sweden, for example. And in many countries, public broadcasters do not only get their money from public sources, from either households or from the state budgets, but they also have commercial sources of income, which are also quite high in some countries, such as Ireland. But in other countries, for example, the UK, Sweden and Spain, public broadcasters are not allowed to have income from advertising, which is of course also a quite pure way of public broadcasting, because in a public broadcaster you wouldn't expect a public broadcaster to make a lot of money from advertising. So I wanted to talk a bit about the role of the European Union, which for its 27 member states has a lot of influence and a lot of policy areas, as I said, are quite centralized nowadays. This is not the case for public service broadcasting, even though the European Union is somehow looking after public broadcasting, but this is really done from a market perspective. And why is that? Because historically the European Union was an economic policy association, and it was intended also to safeguard fair competition across countries. And in the 1990s, this has led to competitors of public broadcasters going to the European Union, to the authorities of the European Union, and to ask them to investigate whether the public funding of public broadcasters actually harms markets and harms the fair competition rights of commercial broadcasters, because as I said, in many of the countries public broadcasters have a strong position. So somehow this has led to these so-called state aid cases, Portuguese in italics here, in which the EU until today oftentimes has investigated whether national public broadcasters actually harm the rights of their competitors. However, already in 1997, the EU has granted its member states the autonomy to fund public broadcasters in their countries, as long as they also define a so-called public service remit for public broadcasters, which means that member states have to really state in a law what public broadcasters should do, what they are allowed to do, what their task is. And this is of course an attempt to also save the fair competition rights of commercial broadcasters, to say it in a positive way. Some people have criticized that this has really led to much too market-driven perspective and has somehow harmed the rights or the possibilities for public broadcasters to actually serve the public. But even though these rules have been set in 1997 already in this Amsterdam Protocol, until today there are state aid cases continuing, so the problem has not really been solved. And also the situation on media markets with internet giants from the US entering European markets has once more led to calls to also curtail the position of public broadcasters, to allow commercial competitors to also make money from their traditional services. And this has also led to objections against public service broadcasters being active in the online field, which is one of the reasons why public service broadcasting is in Europe nowadays mostly broadcasting and not so much public service media, because in many countries there are regulations that are a bit curtailing what public broadcasters can do online. However, this has of course with the rise of Facebook, Google, Instagram and so on, also this has strengthened public broadcasters' position, because now governments were really prone to have national champions that can compete with all these internet giants, or try to compete. They cannot really compete, try to compete, and this has led to a bit softening of these rules that prohibit public broadcasters to do much in the online field. And also the market-driven perspective has vanished a bit at the EU level in recent years, and has been replaced by a new focus on media pluralism and democracy-oriented perspective, particularly due to misinformation that is going on online. So public service broadcasters are typically seen as providers of trustworthy information, and thus also as a source of countering misinformation, which has a bit reinforced their position and made them a bit free from a pure market-driven approach. On the other hand, there is also the Council of Europe, a much less well-known organization, which is though much more active in the field of media pluralism and media and democracy compared to the EU. So when the EU was more in favor of curtailing what public broadcasters are doing, the Council of Europe, with its larger geographical area, which was a bit more the, let's say, defender of public broadcasters. However, the Council of Europe is much less powerful as the European Union. They don't have as many legal rights to decide what their member states are doing. So this is more, let's say, a lip service, which hasn't really changed the situation for public broadcasters. So that's a bit the organizational situation, and now I want to talk about current debates and challenges that are going on in the field of European public broadcasters. So historically speaking, in Europe, public broadcasters have been there to inform, to educate, and to entertain. These are the so-called Raffian principles dating back to the 1920s, roughly 100 years ago, when the BBC was established as the prime example of a public broadcaster in the UK, and the first Director General, Sir John Rafe, coined these three principles, which of course mean that public service broadcasters have a broad remit. They are there to inform, to produce news. They are also there to educate, to have cultural programs, to increase the knowledge of their viewers and listeners and nowadays users. But they are also there to entertain the society. Now, this is the point of these three principles that is nowadays challenged in many European countries, because obviously in 1922, when the BBC was created, the media diet that people could refer to was much smaller. There were not that many media organizations, apps, outlets out there. There was no cable TV, no satellite TV, and so on. So people could turn to much less sources, and it was therefore important that there was like one broadcaster which served all needs of the society. Nowadays, and you see some pictures from famous quiz shows and famous music shows of German public broadcasting here. Nowadays, these offers have become very challenged because people say, okay, let the market provide the entertainment part and let the public broadcasters provide things that are not very easy to produce at the market, because they don't make a lot of profit, and that's more to focus on the inform and educate part.
Just a moment, please. Não, só um comentário, pessoal, até para o Dominik beber água ali. Quando ele fala aqui em Raffian Principles, né, ele está fazendo uma menção ao John Rate, está aqui na ilustração, que foi o primeiro diretor da BBC, the first director of BBC, conglomerate, e que estabeleceu esses três princípios para o serviço público de mídia, né, ou de broadcasting, aí no PSB que ele colocou, e que traz, né, esse conjunto de princípios, um desafio bastante interessante que está presente na apresentação do Dominik em relação a como entreter de uma maneira aliada, conectada a esses princípios de educação e informação, e também, né, fazendo um diálogo com os outros slides, até para quem perdeu aí um pouco a conexão ao longo do tempo, né, como criar bases para a atuação do serviço público de mídia em concorrência com outras iniciativas e de uma maneira também que seja independente, autônoma em termos de financiamento e de gestão. Acho que até aqui na apresentação, né, o Dominik fez, e desculpem reiterar e repetir para quem já tinha acompanhado e compreendido, algumas ponderações bastante interessantes, fazendo essa historiografia, digamos, dos princípios na Europa, E claro, né, daqui a pouco a gente pode discutir também como isso tudo pode ser útil para comunicação pública no Brasil. Algumas pessoas no chat já até embarcaram, digamos assim, nessas reflexões, pedindo para o Dominik nos ajudar a, segundo o comentário aqui, salvar a comunicação pública no país. Dominik, we received a comment dedicated, thank you for the presentation, and dedicated to stimulate your participation here to help to save the public service media in Brazil. It's just one incentive more, to stimulate your presentation, establishing bridges between Germany and, of course, Europe and the Brazilian reality after, of course, your formal presentation here. But please, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and we can go ahead with the next slide as well. So all this debate about whether public service media should also entertain or only inform and educate, or even only inform or even only educate, refers to a very current debate going on in Europe. Not sure about Brazil, but you can talk about that later, I guess, which is about the whole question whether public service media should be universalist or should only cure market failure. And universalism, as the name probably already implies, just means that public service media should serve all groups of society and should serve all groups of society with a large variety of content, including entertainment, including shows, serving all the Raytheon principles. And the idea, of course, is to not only have cultural content or only have news, which may only be of interest to a small elite, but to have programs that really serve minorities, also serve those who don't have an academic background. And the whole idea is also a bit that through a broad programming, people will turn on the TV or go online to watch a show, but then also stick to watch the news that come before or after the show. And this universalism principle is, let's say, historically the European principle of doing public service media, also relating to the fact that these are often strong institutions shaping national culture, like the BBC in the UK. However, in recent years, also in terms of, let's say, neoliberal trends in politics and society, the market failure argument has gained ground, and this has also been supported by, as I said, the new media environment, which offers an amplitude or an ample variety of sources for news and media consumption. So why is there a need now anymore to have a universalist broadcaster if everyone can choose between 6 or 8 or 10 subscription services apart from all the traditional media that are out there? So this argument has gained ground, and for example, there are now calls that public service broadcasters should only produce top-notch documentaries, top-notch news, or cultural content. And the logos you see on the slide refer to two examples from Germany and of France. We have ZDF, it's our national public broadcaster, which is pretty much, it's not really comparable to Globo in Brazil, but it's a national TV broadcaster which is very universalist, having a lot of content. And on the other hand, there's RT, it's joint French and German broadcaster, which is pretty much focusing on cultural content, maybe a bit like TV Cultura in Brazil. It's a very pure public service, but of course it only serves a small group of people that are interested in cultural content. So this was a bit the whole debate about market failure versus universalism. which is being debated over and over again in many countries. So far, public broadcasters have remained rather universalist in most of Europe, but with public funding and independence coming under threat, we might see public broadcasters being curtailed to more market failure broadcasters in many countries. And this also relates to the fact that the independence of public broadcasters is fragile in Europe, has maybe always been fragile, but in recent years has become under severe attack by hostile political forces, often right-wing political forces. And historically, public broadcasters in many countries have been close to the state, but in some cases, as this quote from Karen Donders, one of the most renowned public broadcasting scholars in Europe, who now works for a public broadcaster in Belgium, shows in some cases the interference of politicians has intensified in recent years. However, we can see that even in European Union member states, which are supposed to be very democratic states, governments have difficulties to stick to the idea of having a public broadcaster that is independent of the state. So we see some threats here, and I will go into more detail in the next slides. We see that this question of whether public service broadcasters should be working for the government, should be state broadcasters, or should really be working for civil society, for citizens as a public broadcaster. It's an ongoing challenge in many European countries. We see many public broadcasters being captured by media capture, and I think you will have a very interesting guest here next week who will be able to tell much more about media capture than I can, with Anja Schifrin from Columbia University in New York. But just as a short overview, media capture means that media organizations are not able to decide on their own, are not able to, in the case of public service media, really serve the public, because they are taken over by forces external to the media organization, often external to the media sector itself. So in case of public service media, of course, the state, for the state it's very easy to interfere. For politicians, in case of commercial media, it's often more market forces that come in, and we see that in many European countries, public service broadcasters are being captured increasingly, and there's this one paper from colleagues Mario Stragemuir and Mina Horowitz, who have investigated a bit more the media capture of public broadcasters and have come along with an interesting typology. So if you want to go into more detail there, I recommend you to take a look into this paper that focuses, I think, mostly on the European side, but may also prove valid and valuable in other contexts. Continue. In principle, of course, public service media, because they are public, they are funded by the people, they should be, or could be, the best antidote to capture, as in this quote. But in reality, because it's very easy for the government to interfere with them, they are the first organizations that are going to be taken over by hostile or by political forces. And we have seen this in countries such as Hungary and Poland. I will talk about this in a few minutes as well. So we see that with the rise of authoritarianism that we had in some European countries, and also the rise of populist governments, that public service broadcasters have turned more and more into genuine state broadcasters. And what I mean by that is that they are tools of propaganda, of PR for the government, rather than being really universalist broadcasters, catering to different needs, catering to the opposition, and to people close to the government alike. This is something that is of course not limited to Europe, that can be observed in other countries, but which is particularly striking in Europe because we have seen a decline of democracy in some European countries in the past few years. And this is also reflected in the so-called media pluralism monitor. It's a survey, an expert survey, so they are asking experts how they rate media pluralism every few years. And on this map, also from a study I've done for the EBU, you've seen that media pluralism is at risk in many European countries, all those with either dark or light red colors. In those countries, the risk of PSM independence in this case has increased in recent years. Yeah, you see that PSM have deteriorated in terms of their independence in these states. And another map, again, that reflects what citizens think about PSM being under pressure. So this time it's not the experts who ranked this, it's from a EU-wide, European Union-wide survey that asked people, do you think that your national public service media are free from political pressure or are not free from political pressure? And you see in the green states, people think their PSM are rather free, their political pressure is low. The dark, the light red ones perceive a medium pressure, and in the 5 countries that are in dark red, the 5th country is very, very small. On the bottom, it's Malta, so you wouldn't probably see it at first glimpse. So it's France, Spain, Malta, Greece, and Cyprus. In those countries, all of them being Mediterranean countries, people think that their public broadcasters are under very high political pressure, which somehow reflects a bit also the governance structures and problems in these countries, where it's very easy for politicians to, for example, appoint the director generals or even editors-in-chief of public broadcasters. So 2 very recent and very striking cases on the map of the previous slide. These countries have been in light red. However, if you would ask experts, probably they would have been in, instead of citizens, they would have been in a dark red, because Poland and Hungary have been those 2 countries with the most, let's say, most aggravated democratic backsliding in recent years due to the takeover of very right-wing governments that also undermined the rule of law in these countries, and that also reshaped media systems of their countries. And of course, as in the previous quote, public broadcasters have been the first organizations through which these governments wanted to achieve their means, but also the first organizations that have been rebuilt to fit those new authoritarian, or let's say semi-authoritarian states. So there's a lot of political meddling nowadays. An active politician, for example, in the case of Poland, has been until last year the Director General of the national TV, public TV, and there's also this widespread belief or assumption of the governing party that the public service media should be government media and not really public or the citizens and people's media. And that being said, the remit has also been reshaped in a way that public broadcaster should, for example, reinforce the patriotic values, so serving, let's say, only one faction of the society rather than having a pluralist approach in its coverage. And this is reflected in the fact that Poland is one of the few countries in which the trust in public service media news is very low So in the case of the national TV broadcaster, for the radio broadcaster, I think it's a bit better, but for the TV broadcaster, only 24% of the population express trust in their news coverage. And a very similar case is Hungary, where since roughly 12 years ago, also a right-wing authoritarian government is in power. It's a bit longer than Poland, so they could already reshape the society and the media system much more than the case of Poland. So some observers even go as far as to say that nowadays Hungary is not really a democracy anymore, which is quite striking given that it's a member state of the EU, which is an organization that is being built on the promotion of democratic values, but which has been very reluctant and also hamstrung by its own rules to prevent Hungary from becoming more authoritarian and from stopping the government there. That being said, the media landscape nowadays is pretty much controlled, even commercial media, by the ruling Fidesz party, and has become quite anti-pluralist. And again, the trust in the public broadcaster in this country, unsurprisingly, has become very low over recent years. And again, the governance structures are pretty much controlled by the ruling party, with pretty few safeguards to have a really pluralistic appointment process of, for example, the CEOs and even the journalists who are in charge of operating public broadcasting. And in this case, also the public broadcaster has been used as a tool to provide disinformation, for example, about migration and the European Union itself. So as I said before, the almost 500 media outlets in Hungary, including most of the commercial media outlets, are now believed to be controlled by the government in one way or another. So there's even the question if this government still needs public media, because in some way or another they have captured the whole media landscape. However, that being said, I've now focused on Poland and Hungary as the most striking cases of political interference in the European Union, but we have to admit that it's not only these post-Sovietic countries which after the fall of the Iron Curtain opened up and created public media that have become or that have fallen prey to this authoritarian interference. There is also, let's say, so-called Western countries such as Austria and Spain, and recently also Italy, in which it is very easy for governments to interfere with public broadcasters. Not as easy as in Poland and Hungary, but we have seen quite striking cases of meddling of politicians there as well. So maybe to wrap this whole presentation up with the question of public service media and whether they really serve the public, because obviously the whole remit, the whole idea of having public service media is a bit useless if they are not really in favor of the public, if they are not really catering the society which is paying for them. And of course, one argument against public service media is that why should we have these in Europe very strong institutions if, for example, which is happening, the figures, usage figures, especially in younger generations, are going down and down and down. So why should we still pay for that? Why should we have these institutions that are still very bureaucratic in many countries, that are not really adapted to the digital media environment? Partly, of course, this is because they have been hamstrung to do so by competitors lobbying for very harsh regulation online. But all these things being set apart, why should we have public service media? And there are plenty of studies, including one that I've done for the EBU and also extended a bit on my own, let's say, last year. There are plenty of studies that show positive statistical correlations between the strength of PSM in the country and some indicators of a wealthy democracy. What does the strength of PSM mean? So you could, for example, take the market shares, which, as I said, are lower in some countries and higher in others. You could also take the public money that goes into PSM. Of course, you have to weigh this per capita or per economic strength of a country, because obviously economic wealthy countries like Germany, UK, Switzerland put a lot of money into their PSM compared to other European countries such as Romania, which are more lower income countries. So you have to grade this, but you can in one way or another show that the degree of democracy of a country correlates positively with strong PSM. Also in countries with strong PSM, people tend to have a better knowledge of politics and of public issues. Also the media, the whole media ecosystem, not only public service broadcasters, public service media, but also the media system in general tends to be stronger in countries with strong PSM. So, for example, there is less preoccupation of people with misinformation in countries with strong PSM, and this may be related to the fact that public service broadcasters, if they are strong, also set standards for commercial competitors, which have to orient themselves on this. And there's even a positive correlation between stronger interpersonal trust and stronger trust into media in general and public service media. Of course, we have to be careful, and we cannot interpret this as a causation. It's still a correlation, so it doesn't have to be the case that people trust each other because there's public service media, but in countries with strong public service media, people tend to trust each other more, so there is this correlation which has been shown by many studies. And to give you some more few examples from the study I've done, if there's a stronger market share of PSM, there's a lesser number of citizens that think of authoritarian ruling as a good form of government, so a negative correlation. And the higher the investment in PSM in a country, the bigger is also the quality of deliberative democracy. What does it mean? The higher is the quality of public discourse in a country. The more voices are being heard, the more is freedom of expression being accepted in the country. And we can continue. The higher the stronger a public broadcaster is in a country, the more the citizens in this country are satisfied with the state of democracy. And this holds true for all three indicators: funding of public broadcasters, TV and radio market shares. And the greater the share of the society that thinks that their public broadcaster is free from public pressure, the more the citizens in this country are also satisfied with the diversity of opinions in national news media in general. So it shows somehow that public broadcasters might benefit, might set standards for the whole media ecosystem, because obviously if there should be public broadcasters, it's important that they also take into account the diversity of viewpoints. This is something that I think can be also honestly criticized in many countries, that public service broadcasters have become maybe a bit too elitist and tend to disregard also views of parts of the society that maybe don't have academic education and so on. So there is still work to do there. However, the research shows that if public service broadcasters have a sound funding, if they also have freedom from political interference or relative freedom from political interference, they are able to fulfill all these top-notch, maybe even utopian ideals that are there, that are out there, that are surrounding the whole idea of public broadcasting, as coined in the 1920s by Lord Rave. And to finalize this presentation, I have another quote from Karen Donders, which somehow contextualizes all what I said, because of course the political situation is in which public service broadcasters operate is not only a contextual factor, but it is rather really a co-determined whether they are able to realize the public interest in the media and whether they really serve the public and really offer public value. However, of course we don't have the ideal public service broadcaster. There will always be problems, and even the example of Europe, geographically and culturally often very close area, shows that there is not like one ideal, one model, one size fits all that we can, for example, take to Brazil, or I mean we couldn't even take the Swiss model to Germany and vice versa, because public broadcasting displays itself quite differently in different contexts, whether they be geographical, political, social or historical. And maybe the case of Europe is a prime example for this plurality of public service media, public organization of public service media, that still in somehow more or less can fulfill these ideas of a public remit of the media. And that's it for now, and I'm looking forward to any comments and questions. Thanks for the attention.
Oh.
The German way.
The German way. Okay. Thank you, Dominik, for this presentation. We have a couple of questions proportioned by the audience in diversified places around the world, because we have some questions from Rio, from Portugal, and from Germany about this presentation. A gente recebeu aqui algumas perguntas, pessoal. Eu vou ler as questões, agradecendo mais uma vez, Dominik, pela presença e agradecendo também as pessoas que acompanham online a apresentação. Algumas pessoas me pediram o arquivo para facilitar, compartilhei o arquivo para que as pessoas seguissem também, porque a tela aqui ficou um pouquinho desfocada, mas mesmo assim acho que foi possível assistir e entender as principais ideias. Então, na sequência, eu vou ler as questões para o Dominik comentar e a gente estabelecer esse diálogo com relação a esses pontos. Dominik, please follow the questions using this computer here, and I will read and translate the points, okay, from English into Portuguese. Então, eu queria agradecer aqui as pessoas que participaram do chat, vou começando esse momento de diálogo com a questão enviada, as duas questões enviadas pela Isabela Vieira, diretamente do Rio de Janeiro. Então, Isabela, dá boa tarde e pergunta dos fundos públicos para os operadores de serviço de broadcasting diante das ameaças que a extrema direita e as limitações que têm acontecido nas taxas pagas pela audiência. Então, é possível manter o financiamento público? De que maneira? I think did you follow this translation in the question in English? Okay, the questions in English sent by Isabella. So please, my friend, the answers about these 2 points proportionated by Isabella, and afterwards we have time to talk about the next questions, please.
Okay, so boa tarde, Isabella, as well from me. So if I understand correctly, you mean direct state funding? Yes, perfect. Okay, yes, I think it's a very good question that also pretty much is being debated now in many European countries. So limitations of the fees paid by audiences, it's indeed a problem, because we of course also see shrinking support of the audiences to pay the fees, now with inflation going on worldwide and also in Europe, there's not so many support for even increasing license fees, which might be necessary because inflation also drives the cost of public broadcasters and so on. Yeah, the whole idea of how we should fund public broadcasting, broadcasting service operators in the future, if on the one side there are these extreme right-wing threats and limitations on the fees paid by, I think it's a very good one. And for example, in the UK right now, it's also being discussed whether at least parts of the BBC should be turned into a subscription service like Netflix or Disney Plus. The idea is maybe that the license fee can be a bit less than now, and people would still get news for free and would still get cultural content for free. But if they want to turn on to sports and to entertainment, so we have the whole debate, market failure versus universalism again, they would have to make a subscription. And I think in some way this idea is very appealing, because why should public broadcasters spend a lot of money for sports rights, for example, if it's not really top-notch political programming? So there's some argument in favor of this, but on the other hand, if we really still want to reach the whole of society with public broadcasting, turning it into a subscription service would of course be counterproductive. So this is one example of debates of whether it's possible to keep the public funding despite the pressure, and it could be how to do this, but yeah, I'm not sure if it's really advisable to use this the solution of partly subscription services of public media. So what I think is interesting is these models from not Switzerland, from Sweden and Finland, in which it's not the license fee, it's not collected from audiences, but it's at the same time neither the state budget, it's a specific fund that is being organized by the state, so it could still be influenced by politicians, but it is safeguarded for several years and it's outside of the state budget. So I think this might be a solution as well. Yeah, I think in the end, also in this case, it's hard to find the best way. We still have to struggle and to find out what's going on. I think we will, at least in many European countries, in the next years notice, or we will there will be changes in the funding settlements, the funding systems. In some countries, this way of collecting fees from the audiences might be abolished, and I'm a bit afraid that in most countries this will turn on to the state budget. It has happened in France, for example. France is now financing public broadcasters from the state budget, so this might be a trendsetter, but maybe not the best one in terms of political independence.
Bom, tentando resumir aqui em português a apresentação do Dominik, eu recuperei na tela o slide dele que tratava disso, né, de falar das diferentes formas de financiamento, e aí em relação à questão que Isabela coloca, ele defende, né, esse modelo com orçamento público, mas não necessariamente diretamente administrado pelo Poder Executivo, né, localizado sobretudo nas experiências ali da Sweden, em Finland, e na Suécia e na Finlândia, porque podem assegurar um pouco mais de condições para que o serviço público funcione e seja protegido, né, dessas influências da extrema direita e das limitações pagas por meio das taxas de licença das audiências. Outra questão que surgiu aqui, pessoal, foi enviada pelo professor Elton Bruno Pinheiro, que inclusive manda uma mensagem em alemão aqui. Hallo, Dominik, você viu, o Dominik leu. e pergunta, na sua opinião, qual o principal desafio para os serviços públicos de mídia na Europa, nesse cenário de grande protagonismo das plataformas digitais? E o Elton também pergunta, né, qual poderia ser, né, qual seria uma inovação nesse contexto de mídia, de serviço público de mídia, né? Qual a principal necessidade, melhor dizendo, para a inovação nesse serviço público de mídia, segundo a sua interpretação, Dominik?
Yeah, it's two very relevant questions that I think have been discussed all over the last decade, at least over and over again. And I think there needs still to be found a solution. So also, hello, Elton. Thanks for your question. Questions. So related to the first question, what would be the biggest challenge in the scenario of great protagonism of digital platforms? I think the first thing that obviously comes to mind is that public broadcasters have to compete with these platforms, but I think on the other hand they can't really compete because these digital platforms are really international, whereas public broadcasters are very national. They are there to serve the national culture, and they are also very based on national societies and national languages. So I think, and we can of course discuss whether there should be more international cooperations. We have, for example, the cultural broadcasters I mentioned before, RT, which serves France and Germany, but on the other hand we have many different languages in Europe, so it's still important to have your media in your language. So yeah, I think competing cultural wise doesn't really work for public broadcasters, and of course the financial resources of Google, Facebook, Amazon and so on are much different even from the most well-funded broadcasters of Europe. So maybe we should forget the idea of public broadcasting replacing Netflix, because this is, I guess, what many people, politicians and public broadcasting management representatives still have in mind. So I think we should forget about that. So the real biggest challenge would maybe to build an infrastructure that is similar to, let's say, social networks or maybe even Google, but that is public, which means that it's less market driven, does not exploit its user data, and I think there have been many plans in Europe by European broadcasters to create their own Google, Facebook, whatever. Maybe it's not really possible, but it's an utopian ideal that they still build on. So I think that's the main challenge, to build like a public service internet. There are many ideas about how to do it, but so far it understandably could not be realized due to the mere market power of these actors. So that would be the biggest challenge number one. And to add another biggest challenge, because I think that's equally striking, is for public broadcasters to find the right balance between competing and cooperating with these platforms, because obviously they are out there, and especially young people are using news only on TikTok and Instagram. Increasingly, even journalism students are not turning to newspapers or TV broadcasts anymore. They go to Instagram. So if we want to have universalist public service broadcasters, of course we should expect public broadcasters to be on these platforms. And I think many public broadcasters right now struggle to find the right balance between promoting their own offers and being present on these platforms. And on the other hand, of course, there are also ethical issues. When you are present on the platforms, you have to secure that data of users are being treated in good ways. And I think that is right now in everyday work, I would say that's the biggest challenge for public service media. All this idea of creating a public service internet, it's maybe still more work in progress, but in terms of the everyday work, I would say that finding the right balance between competing and cooperating, being friend or foe with these platforms, that's a very tricky question.
But when you talked about this infrastructure, you talk about software and hardware infrastructure, no?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. It can be both in the end, and I think now with the Elon Musk takeover of X or ex-Twitter, there have again been huge debates because, at least in Germany, Twitter is a very not very much used but very relevant platform for public opinion, and now having Elon Musk steering it, this whole idea of having a public service Twitter, which is not driven by market consideration, and which is maybe also driven in Europe and not in the US. I think it has gained new ground, so this would be more the software solution, but there are also ideas of having a hardware solution with like servers not being located by huge multinational enterprises, but being driven by not the state, of course, because it would make very easy for the state to control its people, but by public service institutions. So yeah, it's a very idealistic thing so far, but yeah, let's see what will happen in the future. And yeah, I think there was a second question, which would be what would need to be most innovated in the context of European PSM, and I would say that in most countries, not in all, but in most countries in Europe, it's still this transformation of public broadcasting to public service media. So really being present online on their own platforms or on third-party platforms, social networks. I think that's really striking if public service media don't want to lose public support in the long run.
Bom, tentando aqui também dialogar com as questões e comentários, né? Acho que o Dominik, indo de trás para frente, falava de como é necessária essa inovação da transformação do serviço público de radiodifusão para um serviço público de mídia que inclua a internet como uma plataforma para produção, distribuição e acesso aos conteúdos. E foi interessante também ele apresentar que um dos grandes desafios, talvez o maior, né, como ele falou, seja também encontrar uma maneira de competir, por um lado, encontrando hardware, infraestrutura de hardware, né, ou seja, de equipamentos, e de software, ou seja, de sistemas, de uma presença online também, e para isso ele exemplificou a importância do Twitter, especialmente para a opinião pública alemã, mas obviamente que não só na Alemanha. E também eu acho que um ponto interessante que ele traz, e que não deixa de ser um grande desafio, especialmente não só para a Europa, mas também, claro, para o serviço público em outros países e outras regiões do mundo, que é como competir e cooperar com as grandes plataformas, né, com as big techs, enfim, para também fazer com que os conteúdos alcancem um público mais universal, digamos, né, levando em conta aquela diferenciação que ele tinha feito de serviço público de mídia mais universalista de um serviço de público mais focado no nicho. Então, para isso ele disse, né, de como que, por exemplo, os estudantes hoje acompanham mais conteúdos pelo Instagram do que propriamente pela TV aberta e até pelo movimento que ele fez de mão aqui pelo jornal impresso, né, digamos assim. Então, seguindo em frente, Jairo Faria envia uma questão relacionada a Media Accountability Instruments, Dominik. Então, falando sobre instrumentos de prestação de contas da mídia ou de responsabilidade social da mídia, poderíamos, né, considerar transparência e mecanismos de transparência e participação como elementos mandatórios, né, elementos obrigatórios para as companhias de serviço público de mídia, serviço público de broadcasting, como eles funcionam nas empresas europeias de serviço público de mídia, serviço público de broadcasting, tema, né, que o Jairo desenvolve já há alguns anos e que pergunta a você, please, Dominik, bitte, talk about it.
Boa noite, Jairo, because it's already night in Germany. thanks for this question. And Jairo and me are actually working on this topic together, so I'm very pleased to see the question here. So if we talk about media accountability, and we have these two aspects of transparency and participation, for my answer I would like to split the transparency and participation. So if we talk about transparency alone, which means public broadcasters publishing figures about how they achieve their goals, about the people they employ, about the decisions they take, even about on the journalistic part, about the editorial values that they apply, editorial decisions, how they deal with editorial complaints, and so on. So I think the transparency part for many European broadcasters is quite developed. There is still much room for improvement, of course, but for example, if you look at the BBC, which in this case I think really is a benchmark, they publish very, very detailed figures on almost everything they do, on their workforce and so on. So you can inform yourself quite detailedly about what they are doing. They have many checklists where they check the compliance with regulatory obligations. Of course, their answer is always yes, so it's also a bit boring because you will also always see they tick the box. So I would say transparency for most of the broadcasters. I have studied at least 4 countries in terms of transparency: Germany, UK, Switzerland, and France. I would say in these countries transparency is quite good. But in the end, the question is how meaningful it is to only publish figures, or whether, and now participation comes in, whether we should also include the public more into decision-making, governance structures, and so on. Of course, it's very hard to include the audience, because the audience in itself is not an organization. They don't have a lobbying group. There are some audience consumer groups, of course, but in general they are not organized. So I would say in terms of participation in most of the countries there is room for improvement. Maybe we shouldn't expect too much of participation, because many of the topics that we deal with in media policy are maybe interesting to us as nerds, as scholars studying media policy, but may not be so relevant for citizens in their everyday life, and also quite understandably. But I would say that many of the governance structures that we do have for PSB and PSM in Europe could be easily and quite meaningfully and relevantly complemented by, for example, audience councils, by audience surveys being taken into account more often than it's done now. So I would say transparency is okay to good, but participation can really be increased. And with regard to the second part of the question, I would say they work quite differently in European PSB, PSM companies according to the different national contexts, because also the culture of participation in general in society, I would say, vary quite a lot between European countries. So in Switzerland, for example, the public broadcaster is organized as a kind of club, a kind of association of citizens. I think it has 25,000 members, so it's not a lot if we think of Switzerland being a country with, I think, 8 or 10 million inhabitants, but still the public broadcaster is run as a kind of citizens association. But I think this model wouldn't work in any of the other countries. So we really have to see the national culture here. But in terms of the overall ranking of participation, I would say that in, let's say all of the countries, I think it's not too far. It's not gone too far. There's really room for improvement.
Então, acho que foi possível acompanhar que ele, inclusive, tem trabalhado com o Jairo nessas questões, e de como que é preciso distinguir transparência de prestação de contas. Então, em termos de transparência, grande parte das iniciativas na Europa tem publicado relatórios com quadros, né, informando as ações que são desenvolvidas, mas, para além disso, é importante estimular a participação do público, né, da audiência, e, para isso, ele, dentre outras experiências, fez menção à Suíça, onde há um clube, né, à volta do serviço público que, de alguma maneira, dialoga com as pessoas que estão, não apenas, nesse caso, recebendo informações, mas também incidindo na gestão das empresas públicas de mídia ou de radiodifusão. Josete, a quem mandamos um abraço, presidenta da Organização Interamericana de Defensoras e Defensores das Audiências, OID, ou AID, envia também aqui uma pergunta para o Dominik: qual o lugar que o jornalismo tem ocupado no serviço público de mídia e nas emissoras privadas de radiodifusão nos países europeus, né? Existe alguma diferença significativa entre os dois modelos? Acho que é uma questão bastante pertinente também, e eu vou incluir aqui até a questão de diferença tecnológica, se ele sente algo relevante em relação a isso, Josete, com a sua, por favor, compreensão. In addition, Dominik, please, is there a substantial difference between this journalism developed by private and public broadcasters in terms of technological ways, in your opinion, or not necessarily the technological questions performed an important role in these different models? Please.
So a very short answer to the question of whether there's any discernible difference between commercial and public broadcasters in terms of journalism. Yes, there is. So I would say in general, for most of the countries, the journalism of public broadcasters is not only much more trusted, let's say it is much more trusted, and there's a reason for it, which is that public broadcasters usually spend much more resources into journalism, so they employ much more journalists than most of the commercial broadcasters do. They often, not always, have higher editorial standards. They also have more transparent editorial guidelines and mechanisms to complain. Not always, but very generalized. Public service journalism is really closer to the ideals of impartial journalism than those of the commercial broadcasters, and also due to market reasons, financial reasons, it has a much larger role in public broadcasters. Of course, they are also oftentimes obliged to, let's say, display a certain number of news items per day and so on. So they have to do it, but also news is not too easy to make money off, so commercial broadcasters don't pay too much attention to it. Of course, there are specialized commercial news channels which also do quite well journalism in many countries, but in general, I would say that the news from public broadcasters have a tendency to be of better quality, also just because of the resources being spent on them. So, for example, international coverage tends to be much better for public broadcasters because they are often one of the few media companies that have foreign correspondents abroad or large networks of foreign correspondents. But of course there are always exemptions. So in countries like Poland and Hungary, where journalism of public broadcasters has been really captured by the governments, nowadays people turn to some of the very few independent outlets that are left there, and in turn these deliver very good journalism. And of course also for all the other countries, I wouldn't say that for example newspapers are not also kind of delivering public service, even though they are not public service media. They also deliver top-notch journalism, but if we ask for the difference between private and public broadcasters in general, I would say their journalism is more advanced qualitatively. If we talk about technology now, I think that one's a bit harder to question because in this case I would say it really depends on the country in Europe. Like some countries like the UK have invested also in better journalism technologies in public broadcasters like AI-based systems, better algorithms and so on. But in many countries where funding has decreased over recent years and where also maybe the topic has not been considered a priority by the politicians who decide what public broadcasting should do or by public broadcasting management themselves. I would say in many countries commercial broadcasters are advanced in terms of technological or trends in innovations in journalism. So yeah, I would say this one really depends per country. And of course with a lot of money going to platforms, they still keep, let's say, a lot of the advancing measures also in terms of journalism. So also public service broadcasters maybe had to rely on innovations that were being brought to them by Google or other platforms.
Bom, então, o Dominik falou que sim, tem havido um investimento na média maior em jornalismo por parte das empresas públicas, das companhias públicas de radiodifusão ou de mídia, em comparação às privadas no âmbito europeu, até porque, em termos de concorrência e busca de audiência, as empresas privadas têm investido mais em outros tipos de conteúdo. E aí, claro, também existem variações em termos de países. Ele recuperou o exemplo que ele já tinha dado aqui da Hungria e da Polônia, países nos quais a mídia tem sido capturada pelos interesses políticos, partidários, com mais intensidade quando comparado aos outros países europeus. E em relação à tecnologia, ele também falou que há uma diferença significativa entre os países e, para exemplificar, disse que, por exemplo, no Reino Unido, a BBC tem investido mais em tecnologia do que outras experiências pela Europa. E agora talvez a gente tenha aqui uma última pergunta, até pelo horário, agradecendo aqui o envio da questão e o apoio na organização desse evento, pelo professor Sivaldo Pereira. I have a question more here, and not in your computer, but I will share with this cell phone to you, Dominik. E o Sivaldo pergunta, né, na sua opinião, qual seria o principal papel e utopia da mídia pública nesse contexto de plataformização e impacto negativo das mídias sociais nas democracias contemporâneas? Please, this question, Dominik. E aí, enquanto o Dominik faz a leitura, queria mais uma vez agradecer a vocês que estão acompanhando esse evento sincronicamente. E quem estiver acompanhando depois, assincronicamente, e quiser interagir com a gente, já deixo o meu e-mail à disposição, paulino@unb.br. Na medida do possível, recebendo mensagens, posso depois encaminhar para o Dominik. E queria também fazer aqui um agradecimento a Danilo Rothberg e a Suzane Fengler, coordenadores do projeto Comunicação e Democracia no Brasil e na Alemanha. E, com isso, claro, agradecer a CAPES e o DAD pelo apoio que têm oferecido ao projeto. Okay? Please.
Okay, thanks Sivaldo for this question. Yeah, I think it's a question I struggle with a bit as well, because I think one utopian ideal that is out there is that public broadcasters, like, as I said, by that I mean really these organizations that are often very bureaucratic, that are pretty much still tailored to the linear, non-digital society. There's this ideal that these organizations maybe get a bit smaller and leave the space to citizens to create public service media by themselves. Like Facebook provides a space to discuss, YouTube provides a space to live stream events, and some people argue that public broadcasters should do more or less the same, but in a public way. So they could offer a platform for citizens to create content, to discuss, and in turn the, let's say, traditional programming of public broadcasters could be reduced. Like, of course, they don't have to ever offer 24 hours linear channels anymore, because linear TV won't be used in 50 years anymore, or maybe even in 20 years, we don't know yet. So there's an idea that somehow this whole internet 2.0, 3.0, whatever you might call this, will be taken over or created by public media through the means of citizens. And I think that's a very attractive idea. On the other hand, I'm also a journalist and a journalism researcher myself, so I personally would still pretty much like to see a sort of more traditional broadcaster. So I would still like to see a lot of news being created by professional journalists who are professionally trained. I would still pretty much like to see documentaries, sports emissions, and so on. And I think it's somehow between these two polarized models, or between these two poles, where we should place the future of public service media. So I think it's necessary to create these spaces like Facebook and YouTube, but with a public angle. I'm maybe a bit pessimistic whether we will really be able to do so, because these digital platforms have just become so powerful and so easy to use, and even we use them, of course, to transmit this event today. So it's hard to compete with them, as I said. So maybe it's not to replace them, but to create an alternative that might become increasingly popular. But I think it's not the task of public service organizations, media organizations, to only provide these spaces. There should be something more, and there should be professional media content created by professional journalists and other media occupations. So I think we should somehow find an ideal that is in between these two extremes, let's say.
Bom, então, Dominik ressaltou a importância, acho que aparentemente utópica, mas não, né, de envolver ainda mais o público e também, por outro lado, não perder essa capacidade de produzir conteúdos, vou chamar assim, de qualidade, com a participação de jornalistas profissionais e com isso oferecendo também, por exemplo, falou de documentários e conteúdos que façam diferença na vida dos cidadãos. E aí eu só vou agregar aqui um ponto que eu acho importante, but not just citizen, no, because children are involved in this your concern, no? Yes. Então, cidadãos e também crianças e adolescentes que não necessariamente votam, né, e sejam considerados cidadãos, mas também têm possibilidade de ter esse acesso e esse compartilhamento na gestão das iniciativas públicas de comunicação. Então, com isso, vou encerrar nossa atividade com uma salva de palmas em formato alemão aqui, né, com a madeirinha, agradecendo mais uma vez o Dominik, Dankeschön, e pedindo que, por favor, as pessoas que acompanharam este evento, né, e tenham ainda algumas questões, que se manifestem, sobretudo pelo e-mail paulino@unb.br, e também fazendo agradecimento à equipe técnica aqui da nossa Faculdade de Comunicação, em nome do Ruiter Corvelo, que proporcionou essa transmissão a partir do Auditório Pompeu de Sousa. Até a próxima.
Obrigado.
assistiu